You can install Linux as either the only operating system on your computer, or you can set up your computer to dual boot between operating systems. If you're on a Mac, then setting up dual boot is a little bit tricky, and you will want to do a Google search to find the current instructions for it. If you are running Windows, then most distributions will give an option to set up dual boot automatically as part of the install process. The install will then repartition the drive on the fly, install Linux, and set up the bootloader to give you a menu for which operating system to boot to. Of course, before you try to set up a dual boot system, make sure you have a good backup of your computer. The easiest is to use some software to image your hard drive so that you can get it back looking just like when you started. There are a number of good options out there, like the commercial software Acronis TrueImage, or open source software Clonezilla, or Redo Backup and Recovery. You will need an external hard drive that has enough space to hold the entire contents of the hard drive you are cloning. What is really nice about cloning is you get back to where you were right before the backup, simply by restoring the clone image. So you can restore very fast. It is always a good idea to keep a clone image of your drive that you refresh weekly, and yes, you can restore that image to a different physical drive if you have a drive failure. I'm going to do the install on a virtual computer, but the steps for doing the install on a physical computer are exactly the same. I'm also going to do a dual boot install alongside Windows 10. If you want to have just Linux on the computer or do a Linux only install on a virtual machine, the only difference in the install is the one screen for the partitioning when it senses my Windows installation. So I have a virtual computer with Windows 10 installed on it. I'm going to go into the setup of that virtual computer in VirtualBox and set up to connect the Linux Mint Cinnamon ISO image to the CD drive. This is similar to putting the CD or USB drive into your physical computer and then booting to that media. Next, I will turn on the computer. The computer boots to Linux Mint from the CD or USB drive. You can actually just start using Mint at this point to play around with. You won't be able to save changes, but it will work. On the desktop, though, you will see an icon for installing Linux Mint. Double-click on the icon. This will take you to the install program. You will first select the language to do the install and click Continue. Then there's a screen where you can select to install third-party software. You will want to check this. This will install software that might not be open source software. It's still free, it's just made by companies and distributed with a closed license. There is probably a legal reason for that question on the screen, but it is also in part due to the fanatical attitude of some open source fanboys and fangirls have about the evil empire of closed source commercial software. You can start holy wars talking about open source versus closed source with some geeks. It's kind of like the Chevy versus Ford fight of the geek world. Moving on. Next is the screen that will let you choose to set up a dual boot system if it senses Windows on the hard drive. Otherwise, it will just be the other options for erasing the entire disk or letting you do a custom partitioning to the system. In our case, we will select to set up a dual boot. This will bring us to another screen to determine how much space to take away from Windows for Linux. You will get a slider to adjust the space in each OS. This is one of the pretty amazing parts of Linux, that it can actually repartition the drive on the fly and set up two operating systems to exist side by side. This is also why I said to make sure to have a great backup of the system. If this goes south, although it almost always works, then Windows will no longer work and you will have to start from scratch if you don't have a good image of the drive. Once you select how much space to use for Linux, you will get two separate warnings that the install is getting ready to write the changes to the partition table of the hard drive. This is the point of no return. Up until this point, nothing has been written to the computer hard drive. Now it is time to take the plunge by accepting Continue on each of these screens. There are just a couple steps left at this point. The first is to select your time zone, easy enough. Then you will select the keyboard layout. Normally you can just take the default. Finally, you are going to set up your primary user. Enter your full name. Next, you get to name the computer. Then you can change your username from just your first name if you want. Then set up your password. I highly recommend you do not set up to automatically log in. That is a very bad idea that should come with huge warnings about the stupidity of the option and destroying the fabric of the space-time continuum, or something equally as scary. You can also select to encrypt your home folder. This is a really good idea if you'll be sharing the computers with others. If this is a virtual computer on top of another computer and you are just playing, then it's sort of a waste of CPU cycles. Now click Continue and wait for a few minutes while it is all installed. While this installs, let's talk about a couple things. Linux Mint is developed as a distro for making a workstation for you to use day to day. So it will automatically install with a GUI desktop, and it will install a set of very common software like LibreOffice, a web browser, and some other applications. If you are doing Red Hat, CentOS, SUSE, or some of the other distros, then there are screens to determine if you want a GUI or not, if you want desktop applications or not, what applications you might want to install by default, what type of server you might be installing, etc. You can decide to do a LAMP server install, or a database server, or a simple web server, or a full-blown workstation desktop. So you will have additional screens. CentOS by default installs almost nothing. SUSE by default gives some server stuff and some desktop stuff, but they both have screens to guide you through all the customization at install. You can see why I like Linux Mint Cinnamon for an intro distribution. We are given a very streamlined starting point. You will be able to change all that later if you want. Linux is about flexibility. You can make it what you want to. But choosing a distro is also about finding something where the install is geared toward what you are looking to start with. Once the install is done, you will get a prompt to restart the computer. At some point in the restart, it will ask you to remove the install media. Then you will get the boot menu to select between Linux and Windows. Then, when you select Linux, it will take you on into the Linux login screen. You now have a functioning Linux workstation. Enter your password and press Enter. Once logged in, you will see the desktop screen. It looks pretty cool. You can make some pretty amazing changes by installing and changing themes, and yes, you can change your desktop background. You can even change what the login screen looks like. Go ahead now and start to explore.